Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the weekly MMA Cycles Market Update. This is Gianni DePocha, your host, and I'm joined this week by a very special guest, one of the original graduates of the Merriman Market Timing Academy, Kat Powell. Kat, how are you doing today? Thank you for joining me.
I'm doing pretty good. Good to see you, Johnny.
Good to see you as well. Well, we have a lot to talk about today. Very interesting week in markets, short squeeze unfolding here. We had a Mercury retrograde, seemingly false breakdown unfold. But before we get into all of that, Kat, would you take a moment to introduce yourself to all of our viewers and tell us a little bit about your background?
I come from a really strong visual background. I did video production for over 20 years, freelance, independent for corporate communications, et cetera. And that whole idea of looking at things visually was what pulled me into astrology and then following Ray early on in financial markets. So when his class opportunity came up, I thought, well, why not? Because we had just gone through the whole 08 crisis and the 09 bottom, and people were trying to trade out of that. And I said to myself at that time, I never want to feel like that again. I never want to be in a market where I don't have an idea of what's going to happen next. So that's why I took the little astrology that I knew at the time and then pushed it over to the financial side and joined his class. And when you go through this, though, and you've been using other techniques to look at the market, and now you're going to integrate astrology. I remember Ulrich was there the very first day we were talking at lunch, one of the first lunches, and I was explaining to him why astrology dovetails so nicely with market patterns. And I remember this was so funny because I said dovetail, and Ulrich didn't know what dovetail meant. And one person over for him starts illustrating, the whole concept of how things dovetail. So when you have an international group like that that gets together and starts talking in all these languages, literally visual, data, markets, astrology, there's this synergy that's really unique.
Yeah.
And that was an amazing energy for that first group. And so many of us just stuck with it, stayed through it for the second year, because that's when you get into the nitty gritty.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing to think that was a decade ago. And
yeah,
to your point, Kat, it's all very conceptual. We have to be able to think and analyze in concepts of time, concepts of geocosmics, and concepts of technicals. So very good. Well, let's talk about these markets, Kat. I'm going to share my screen here and pull up a chart of the Dow Jones. And then I know you brought a couple visuals or one very good visual, I should say, as it pertains to some upcoming geocosmics. So obviously we're in this Mercury retrograde period now. And the Dow declined into a low on Wednesday and quickly reverted back higher. This is typical Mercury retrograde price action. Next week, we have Pluto going retrograde on the 1st, as well as a Venus square Neptune aspect a day after the Fed rate hike decision. And then Venus will go into Cancer on the 7th of May. So going out near the highs of the week and the month is typically construed as bullish price action. So Kat, what are your views on the equity indices right now?
Well, here's the most important thing. Friends don't let friends trade Mercury retrograde. So, I mean, you're really asking for it. Yeah, it's possible you're going to get a double top here, and then you're going to maybe get the bottom part of a handle there, a cup and handle situation, or an inverted hit. What is it going to play out like? But any moment now, you're going to run into some serious resistance.
Right.
And, and then now what? How much of a correction will you get? And the other thing, some of you know that I practice Elliott wave and follow it. We know there's a very high correlation with Mercury retrograde to wave fours. So classic chop and slop. You're going to have a trader's market, but not an investor's market.
Right. Well, this is pretty meaningful resistance here in that, 34,000, 34,500 area. So that's been a line in the sand for the Dow, really going back to last August. But the Dow already took out that high from last August. But I'm going to pivot here and look at the Nasdaq because the Nasdaq still has not. And we know that's a very important concept in the MMA methodology, intermarket divergence. So, to me, until we see the S&P and the Nasdaq take out those highs from August, we do need to exercise some caution. But from a cyclical standpoint, I do think, there are some short-term tailwinds, but, as you just said, Kat, Mercury retrograde really is more of a geocosmic signature for short-term aggressive traders. wouldn't be betting the house, so to speak, under this aspect. But what are your thoughts on the Nasdaq and tech? Obviously, coming out of Saturn's transit through Aquarius, tech struggled. So, any other comments of note you want to make on the stock markets?
Well, it's really interesting because when I was going to lecture last year and then couldn't, one of the things I wanted to look at and talk about was that this is really an inverse echo of the 1999, 2000 situation, because at that point you had Saturn and Taurus and Uranus in Aquarius. You had the inverted. And I kept wondering, what will that do? And it ended up being the same situation. The Nasdaq's taking it hard. Mm-hmm. With even though you've got the same energies in square, the Nasdaq's taking a big brunt, and it's the most volatile right now in terms of what it will do. You got some of your large, you're looking at what Microsoft this week has done and what some of the others have done, and you're like, again, you're looking at, you could get an aggressive situation with a double top.
Yeah.
Look at this gap up, you know what I mean? So are you going to get a gap fill once in this Mercury retrograde cycle? It wouldn't be unusual.
Right.
So that's tech. Yeah, I would keep an eye on this, because one of the things, now I'm going to talk far out. One of the things you really want to do and look at long term is you want to be in the right position at the right time in a market before a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction.
Yes.
And that's next year. So we know that if you're a long-term investor or even just a shorter-term investor, you're looking for that consolidation. Is it going to be a breakout into that Jupiter-Uranus cycle, or is that going to be a crest and then we have a decline? So while I know there are plenty of people in the bear camp from a rational perspective about what's going on in the world and money supply, et cetera, you have to ask yourself, is that really going to happen? Are we going to get an extended decline, or are we going to be just sideways, which we've talked about and Ray has talked about several times?
Well, I think what you just brought up, that signature between Jupiter and Uranus next year, is a great segue into the next market I wanted to discuss with you, which is the US dollar. I'm looking at the ETF here because we don't have the closing prices for the euro or the yen today. But, obviously Jupiter is about to go into Taurus here. And I covered this with Ulrich. Wow, I guess it would have been like a year ago. But, when Uranus first ingressed into Taurus back in 2018, it did lead to a big boom in the US dollar. And, this is despite seemingly increasingly calls for a collapse in the dollar. Well, it just really is not trading that way. So obviously we've had a short-term correction since the highs in September in the US dollar. But with Jupiter in the last few degrees of Aries here, and you just mentioned, positioning yourself ahead of these geocosmic signatures. What's your take on what's going on currency markets in the US dollar? Because I think Jupiter going into Taurus could potentially be a tailwind for the world reserve currency here.
That's an interesting point. Or is it going to be also tied to an increase in money supply? Are we going to see like a liquidity situation that we were getting start to get mitigated because of the Jupiter influence?
Yeah.
Jupiter and Taurus, that has always been an interesting measurement of, like, you can get crest into that when Jupiter is transiting through Taurus. There's a history of that, and we've got it illustrated on some charts in various places. So you have a hard time betting against that. And at the moment, you're talking about Venus square Neptune coming up. Well, we know that's rose-colored glasses. Even in square, that's a selective vision energy. Where you're looking for the glass to be half full. As opposed to a Venus Saturn energy where the glass is not only empty, it needs washing. So that's a good
way to put it. I like that.
Yeah, that's the kind of the opposite of that whole Neptune Venus. So would I be looking for the market in this Neptune Venus situation to possibly reverse after that, after the Fed and after the rose-colored glasses energy is over? I would be aware that, that Mercury retrograde always has typically a reversion in the middle of the cycle when the Sun and Mercury conjunct. You have to watch the metals for that too.
Well,
so that's your dollar conversation.
Yeah. Well, this ties into, I pulled up a chart of the 10-year Treasury yield here. Pluto's going retrograde. Is it the day before or 2 days before the Fed rate hike decision? And then, you and I had been discussing how, we also have Venus retrograde coming up this summer between July and September. And a lot of times you see Fed policy stances modified during that period. So, again, what is the catalyst? We don't exactly know in advance, but we can see, storm clouds gathering. But, you were just talking about Venus square Neptune, but I think when it comes to debt markets and interest rates, which tie into currency markets, Pluto going retrograde could be a big move. And yields are coming down here on Friday, but overall, they're still up on the week. Obviously, interest rates have been going up generally since the low during the COVID crash and the Capricorn climax in March 2020. So, anything else you wanted to add to interest rates and what's going on in debt markets, or are all good on that?
I'm good on that. This is such an interesting situation here, trying to guess whether or not, they're not going to, they're not going to reverse right now.
No, I don't think so either.
Yeah. So, you're going to continue to get this push for higher rates, and the inflation numbers that just came in are not as great as everybody would like to see. Right. We're still pushing that. So, let's see what happens during this Mercury retrograde cycle. There's going to be a lot of now we're talking, TARS, reevaluating, because you're talking about a Venus energy of what has value.
Yes.
So whenever you have a retrograde cycle, this, but for your rest of the audience, you want to put an RE in front of anything, like renegotiate, reevaluate, rebudget, replan, just anything with an RE, because that's that interval. So over this 3-week interval of Mercury retrograde, we know we're going to see reconsideration and reevaluation. But we've got to get past that Venus Neptune happy pill.
Indeed. Well, Kat, we're talking about debt markets here, and I actually do want to pivot real quick and look at this visual that you sent me to be shared here, because you drew some very interesting parallels to the upcoming debt ceiling showdown in the U.S. and the geocosmics that were present the last time we had a really significant debt ceiling showdown in the United States. We're looking at a chart from back in 2011, a 60-minute hourly chart in the S&P 500. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this chart here? As you said, you are the graphics person.
Yeah,
so.
This I actually did this back when this is leftover from when we were studying in the first 2 years Ray's course.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because it was really relevant at that time, because it was just behind us, since the class was 2013, 2014. But I illustrated this for myself because I was trying to really look at patterns regarding Mars square Uranus, which has been called a crash signature. So I started looking at some of these, trying to find out, well, is that true? When you're in the first year of Ray's class, you're questioning and you're learning things. You're saying, okay, now I need to apply this. So I went and looked at this, and this is the debt ceiling situation, which was in 2011, and Mercury's retrograde A2, and that's when the decision was made about the debt ceiling. And, you're already declining from a crest, and it just accelerates, and then we get a downgrade on the credit rating for the U.S., and it falls literally into the Mars-Uranus square and the Mars opposition to Pluto. And then as Mercury goes direct, you're coming out of that bottom, but you take it out again in October. So this is the kind of stuff to illustrate to you that in a Mercury retrograde cycle, sometimes you just go sideways, and sometimes you get these really big dramatic moves. And if you look at what happened prior to the 2020 conjunction, you've got the same situation with Mercury retrograde in there, right around that massive pileup in 2020 with Jupiter, Pluto, and Saturn. That Mercury retrograde preceding that or around that was the same volatile decline. So, and what's interesting is this was in Virgo. This Mercury retro was an Earth that backed into Leo. So it backed into fire. So now I'm looking ahead to the Venus retrograde in Leo this summer and going, okay. And we know that Mars will be also in what? Leo, when it opposes Pluto. So this is that interesting situation here, because if I'm not mistaken, and maybe he'll respond at some point and send his data in, and Ray remembers this, Mark Steierman, one of the original students, did some research around Venus in Leo, and I think retrograding in Leo and recessions. but I don't remember the exact data correlation he found. So yeah, this is the thing you want to be aware of, because even though the squares are coming in May, that means you could be declining into summer, the Venus in Leo, or you could find that's the chance where we get a reversal because the market's declined enough that the Feds change their mind. It wouldn't be the first time that we've seen a strong correlation of a Venus retrograde cycle and a Fed change of behavior.
Well, I just think it's interesting, Kat, how, we have this debt ceiling situation in the next month in this Mercury retrograde period, and we're going to have Mars opposite Pluto, next month as well. So
yeah, so I dug this out and said, I really want to pay attention to this because I don't remember when Uranus is going to retrograde again. But with things flipped like they were, because see, a lot of times the Saturn-Uranus square precedes the Saturn-Pluto energy. We got the inverted this time.
Right.
So when you look at some of these older charts that I also have where I've illustrated this, you have to almost take a look at it and say, will the pattern also reverse? In other words, do you have the low and then the crest, and you're going to get a serious decline? So it's tricky. That's the Mercury retrograde part.
That's the trickster. That's the trickster. Kat, I do want to look at one more market with you, crude oil, since I know that's a market that you and I have had conversations on before. So I'm going to pull up USO, the crude oil fund here. Really nice rally here on Friday, bringing prices off the lows of the week. That was a pretty scary decline for the bullish case earlier this week. So what's your take on the energy market? I do think that the weight of the evidence suggests that this low in March was at the very least an intermediate term cycle low.
I agree. And I'm looking at that support shelf running right across there. You know what I mean? That's a pretty strong level. And that downturn so far is not looking anything but corrective. At the moment with this reversal, let's see if it can get above a descending trend line there. But that's about what are we looking at? Oh, not even quite a 50% correction of the move.
Right.
So you've got this. If it can break out of this, then you know exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So you're about where you should be. This is your classic stuff. You learn that after let's say it's a move up, your first move up in the beginning of a bull market, that a 50 to 68 to the 61.8 correction is really classic for a move up off of a low. So at this moment, you hedge this. You hope it breaks out, but you could always be prepared for it not. But with Mercury retrograde, let's see, it should probably at least get up and challenge that previous. Look at this consolidation zone you've got around 70. You know what I mean? There's going to be some resistance there, obviously. Let's see if it can get to that and before you make a decision, because this pattern coming off of here is getting a little aggressive, this rally.
Yes.
And we know, but the Venus-Neptune again, you're looking at, with Neptune as a co-ruler for crude oil, you may get a false moment here. This may be a false rally. So I would be careful about that.
All right. Well,
I'm sorry. Yeah. One more thing.
That's very good.
The Mars Pluto, would have me more worried about the oil market, because I would be concerned about possible, some kind of act of sabotage or war or something that created a demand crisis.
Yeah, I do agree. I do think geopolitically next month we have to tread carefully. So, well, everyone, if you liked what Kat had to say, I know I did. She's going to be a guest speaker at our MMTA Course 2 Investment Retreat in Troy, Michigan. That's going to be the first weekend of June. Details can be found at www.mmacycles.com. And in terms of announcements, just have a couple quick ones. We did have the monthly grains report was just published, as well as the monthly MMA addendum report. Both of those are written by MMTA graduates, Wyatt Fellows, and Puyan Zulfagarnia. So I just wanted to share that. Kat, do you have any last comments before we wrap it up here?
Yeah, just remember, it's Mercury retrograde. So just be cautious.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me this week, Kat. And again, I look forward to seeing you at the investment retreat in June.
Okay. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.